Welcome to the Relationship Recovery Podcast, hosted by Jessica Knight, a certified life coach who specializes in narcissistic and emotional abuse. This podcast is intended to help you identify manipulative and abusive behavior, set boundaries with yourself and others, and heal the relationship with yourself so you can learn to love in a healthy way.
Hello, and thank you for being here. I have a very special episode today with Misha Patel. Misha is a British-born South Asian therapist and coach who specializes in supporting South Asians all over the world who have experienced narcissistic abuse and trauma. Through her business, Therapy with Misha, she's on a mission to break the stigma around mental health in the South Asian community and raise awareness that mental health matters. Having recognized the stigma was causing many South Asians to suffer in silence, she pivoted her business to provide a safe space to share experiences and heal. Her work with clients combines detailed education into the trauma of psychological abuse and the resulting complex PTSD with a range of somatic healing modalities, including brain spotting, psychotherapy, inner child healing, and neurolinguistic programming to help go from barely surviving to effortlessly thriving. Misha and I were part of the same training in narcissistic and emotional abuse. And the reason that I wanted to connect with her was because I work with a lot of clients on narcissistic abuse in South Asian communities. They are either experiencing it in their marriage or with their in-laws, or even recovering from what they've gone through in their history and how that is showing up in their life today. We don't touch on this until the end of the podcast, so I want to say it now. This podcast is not about India is bad or narcissism only exists in India. A lot of people, or actually 90% of the people that listen to this podcast, are located in the United States. And we know, in capitals, know how narcissism exists everywhere, but also here. I could do a narcissism in the United States episode or narcissism in Catholic communities episode. I could do it across the board. I could do it for almost probably any country. This is really just to shed light on this one specific issue that is happening because it is prevalent, because it is a culture where they don't really talk about it. And I know that I want, and I know from talking with Misha that she also wants people to feel like they have agency, that they can heal, that they can move out of trauma responses and begin to live a life that feels like theirs. I hope that this episode is really helpful. And if you're listening to this and you are part of the South Asian community, that listening to this might help you feel heard and seen. Hi, Misha. Thank you for being here with me today.
Hi, Jessica. Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
Can you tell us a little bit about the work that you do?
So I'm a narcissistic abuse specialist and narcissistic trauma-informed coach and therapist, and I work with mainly the South Asian community to help raise awareness about narcissistic and emotional abuse, any type of psychological abuse, and to heal. I give them hope and I give them a safe space to just talk and listen, to feel heard, because so many people suffer in silence and they don't know what's happening to them. They hold a lot of shame, a lot of guilt, a lot of self-blame. So I'm there to give them that safe space and start them on their healing journey so they can then go from surviving to thriving, codependent to independent, and just live their lives as their true, authentic selves.
Yeah, I have the chills just listening to that because it's like that is exactly what the journey is like. Can you speak to the reasons behind there being such a large presence of narcissism in South Asian culture?
I think it all stems back to the upbringing. Generally, it is male dominant. The female is expected to do what the male tells them to do. So it is already quite a controlling environment, and girls aren't seen as equal. So in a lot of families, even now, when a daughter is born, it is not celebrated. It was seen as a daughter was a burden. very much like in my generation, your kids are seen as kids, but in the older generation, it was seen that the daughter's a burden because many people had dowries on marriage, like you had to pay people off to take your daughter away from you, basically. So the daughter was always kind of seen as wife material, and she's only there temporarily. We're going to raise her and then we're going to marry her off. So it's very male dominant. And I think that is what has caused a lot of narcissism. And you do find generally there's more male narcissists than females in the Asian culture because the man is very grandiose. They don't have that self-awareness. They very much feel like they can control people. They love to show off and show people that they are in power. So the woman is never seen as equal.
And in that dynamic of the woman not being seen as equal, it's interesting because when I work with people, I attract a lot of people that have a very strong in-laws that are very opinionated. Can you speak a little bit to that structure? Because when I was listening to you and like thinking about, a girl not being celebrated and then thinking how powerful, I guess like the Indian mother-in-law can be, what leads to that dynamic?
So I guess the daughter-in-law's duty is to look after her in-laws when they're older, and a lot of them see their son's wife as a slave. I mean, it's a bit of an extreme way to describe it, but it is seen as she's coming into this household and her duty is to cook and clean and look after everyone. She's not really allowed to work and be independent and have her own income. It's very much a controlled environment. That was traditionally. Nowadays, it is more of they are allowed to go out there and earn as well, but they're still expected to do everything else on top of that. So it's like you have to become this 24-hour machine that is expected to look after yourself, to provide an income in the household, to then look after the extended family as well. It's just an expectation. So for the in-laws, having this daughter-in-law come in, if she doesn't conform, then she does become that victim of abuse and she's living that life controlled by everyone.
So even now in modern day times, you'd say that that expectation is still there. But in addition, the woman is also expected to have a job.
Yeah. A lot of the times now it's like that she's got to do everything. She's basically got to do everything the male can do, plus raise the family, deal with all the housework, deal with everything else. Yeah. Whereas his job is to just go out. It's like, in evolution, the male's job was to go out and hunt for the food and the female's job was to raise the children. So it's very much like that. But the female's also expected to do everything else as well that the male can do.
And so that actually sounds like almost like in a way normalizing living in an environment where the fawn response is normalized, where like you're almost like living in that all the time. Can you speak to that a little bit?
So when the daughter is born, she's already born feeling unwanted. So she's learned from a young age, right, that she's born codependent. And she's learned from a young age that I have to please everyone else to feel loved, to feel wanted, to feel like I'm good enough, to feel like I'm important. So that just goes from with the extended family and the parental relationship to the in-laws, the husband, even in friendships. I see this at work. I see this with children and their teachers at school. That they are constantly in that fawn response that I need to please everyone so I can feel good enough. They are true codependents and they're just raised that way because they were never allowed to just be them. It was like, you can't wear that. What will so-and-so think? Or somebody's coming over for dinner and you're expected to be the one that gives them the glass of water and to welcome them and to be there to help with cooking in the kitchen. And the males are allowed to just do what they want. The male present isn't really needed because the girl is expected to do all of that. So she's constantly in fawning. And you do get males like that now. I think there's more codependent males in my generation than in the older generation. It's more codependent females and narcissistic males. And now in this generation, I think it is a mixture of both. Generally, it is still the male that is more narcissistic, but I am finding that there are a mixture. There are men out there that have been brought up controlled with very, very high expectations from their parents as well. So they've been in a fawning mode.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that, about how a male is raised and what the expectations are and the influence of gossip?
Yeah. So it's very much the parent. If you've got a narcissistic parent, they see the child as an extension of themselves, right? So for the children, as soon as you're born, it's like you have such high expectations put on you to succeed in every area, to get a really, really good job, to get married at a certain age, to then have children and to look after your parents. There's a lot of expectations put on you. If you wanted to just go and be a footballer, you couldn't do that. Your education was very, very important, and the way that you were perceived by everyone else. So it's not just the household that you're trying to please, it is the whole community. And I've gone a bit off track. So what was the question again?
Yeah, how the males are raised to sort of like, I guess how narcissism is infused a bit in the raising so that the male not grows up to be a narcissist, but like grows up believing the same beliefs as their parents are putting
Yeah.
on them, and the influence of the outside gossip. Because I know that in my work, I see that all the time, is that it's not just about this is what they want for me. It's this is what they want for me and how they want to be able to tell other people, which opens a whole cohort of issues.
Yeah. So it's a very much shame-based culture. Well, not culture, but shame-based upbringing. So the values, the core values have become more about other people as the generations have gone on. So you're seen as a failure. If you don't meet these expectations, you are seen as a failure, and your parents are seen as a failure. So if you wanted to just go out there and be a footballer, that bring a lot of shame to your parents because it's not an acceptable vocation.
Mm-hmm.
Like things that are generally acceptable are in the medical field or running a successful business. Those kind of things are deemed as acceptable. Whereas the arts and the dramas and those kind of things are not seen as a set income. And I guess it stems back from survival mode, where a lot of them didn't have income. A lot of them were brought up in poorer families. So the only way to kind of escape that in India is to go get yourself educated, because a lot of the older generation, education wasn't accessible to them. So they put a lot of importance on their children having this opportunity and to use it and to do really, really well, so they can then provide for their family. So it's coming from a loving intention, but where they've got that controlled environment, it's also coming from the fact that they want to use their child to say to others, look how great I've done as a parent.
Mm-hmm.
Look how well I've raised my child. So in our line of work, a lot of people stay in abusive situations because they are afraid of letting down their parents and bringing shame to the family. So there's a lot of shame that can come from, like, you're raised to feel shamed for what you wear, for how you talk, for what you say, if it doesn't conform to society's expectations.
And you and I touched on this when we were chatting before the call. It's also shame is brought on mental health and getting help for mental health.
Yeah, it's seen as a stigma.
Mm-hmm.
And previously, when anyone had like a mental health condition, they were very much isolated and stigmatized, and it was seen as a failure. It was seen as shameful. So families would kind of keep these secrets behind closed doors. I still see it now, where anyone that is suffering from a mental health condition, they don't feel that they can reach out because it is seen as like they've failed. They're not good enough as a person because they are struggling. So there are people that won't even let their families get the help that they need, even though they could get support and feel better. They don't want the general community to know, or they don't want anyone else outside the house to know. So it's this kind of secret, and the victim has to unfortunately just deal with it.
And it perpetuates the shame that the victim feels, right? Like when we can't normalize it and we can't get the help for it, it's I'm bad because I'm struggling. There's something wrong with me, rather than this is so deep seated, right? But, I think you and I know that a narcissist is like unwilling and unable to even understand that they have shame. So it sounds like even it's just like a breeding ground for shame to exist and to be hidden.
Yeah, and that is why so many people just suffer in silence, and they blame themselves. They think it must be me because I can't get myself out of this situation, and everyone around me is able to get to not feel this way. But it's trauma, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I wonder, do you feel that, I really mean this for in country, not those that have left, and I'll touch on that soon, but when they're living in the environment and living in the country, do you feel like people are aware that there's hope that you can get, that this is not the way that it has to be, or is this what they think it is?
I think now with social media and social media being so accessible and people being so open and talking about mental health struggles. And there have been a few kind of high profile, like Bollywood suicides and things like that. So I think people are now starting to talk about it a bit more, more in the younger generation. So with the older generation, they generally won't reach out for help. Whereas the younger generation, they are more kind of able to take themselves out of that situation where they aren't as controlled by their parents in society, and they are able to access the help. Whether they do it privately, a lot of people, even a lot of my clients, nobody in their circle, their inner circle, knows that they are having therapy because they still feel that they'll be judged and they will be shamed, and it just takes them back into that cycle, doesn't it? So they kind of think of it as, I'm going to get my help privately. I'm going to get myself better. And I can relate to this as well. I didn't openly talk about the journey that I'd gone through with therapy until I had got out the other end, where I was able to recognize that it's not something to be shameful for. When I had experienced the benefits of it, I was able to then openly talk about it because it didn't affect me what other people thought or said, because I just know how valuable it was.
Yeah.
So I think it has changed now. I think it's evolving. I wouldn't say it's perfect, but it is evolving a bit more, and it's becoming a bit more westernized in the way that the country's developing.
Yeah. So you are in the UK and I'm in the US, and a lot of families decide to relocate, for work or whatever reasons to where we are. And I work with mostly women. Actually, it's all women and one male who relocated from India. They're living here, but they are still dealing with a lot of the rules, the traditions, and the regulations of what it takes to be a part of the Indian family, whether it's financial or just speaking on the phone every single day. Like, there's a lot of things that happen. And I see how it creates conflict in the marriages, but also conflict between the families, because I think there's a new life that they're trying to create here. There's obviously a lot of differences. There's, in a lot of people that can set boundaries in a different way here. And I'm sure where you are, but they feel stuck to stuck to the culture that they're dealing with. And so can you speak a little bit to what you notice in the UK from families that relocate?
I think it's very similar to what it's like in the States where you are. And it's those expectations, but there's also a lot of misunderstanding, because in the South Asian countries, they don't quite know what it's like here. They don't quite know how hard you have to work to get where you need to be. They see it as a very much easy life, whereas honestly, it's easier for them because they can just get that things are so much more accessible. You have people to do everything for you. Like, if you need a wedding planned, it can be done in 48 hours. Whereas here, they don't understand that we have to plan things, that there's timing, you have to be somewhere. They can't just delay a whole ceremony because you're late. Like, people have such fast-paced, pressured lives here, and they don't understand that there. But they still expect the expectations as if they were living together. So if you have in-laws in India, for example, and then you're living in the UK or America, you are still expected to tell them what's going on with your life every day, make that daily phone call as if you were still living there.
And there's also a financial commitment too, it sounds like, or at least that's what I've seen, is that even if the family is more well off in India, you still are expected to send money. And I've watched some of my clients struggle with, they're not taking care of their needs because they have to send a certain amount of money overseas.
Yeah, they're controlled by having that duty as a child to look after your parents, and having that duty that you've come out of that, like, there for a better life out here. But they don't see how hard you have to work to get that money. They don't see that how costly things are for us in the Western culture. Things are so much cheaper for them over there that they think it's like that here. And they don't understand that it's hard to get that money. And then for the people that are in the Western cultures, right, they've been raised to look after their parents, and they've been raised to look after the older generation. So it's like an expectation that I've managed to, my parents weren't able to have this education, and they weren't able to go out and get good jobs. So now that they've given me all of this and they've given me this upbringing, they've made a lot of sacrifices. It's my duty as a son or daughter to send them money back home.
Yeah. And, you mentioned the control that it breeds and the control that a family living here may still feel. And I don't want to use my client example, so I'll speak to just overall the work that issues I've seen, but the prominent character in a lot of the things that a lot of the people I've worked with has been the mother-in-law or the mother. I mean, because I work with the female, it would be her mother-in-law. And there's a very strong sense of control. And when they start to realize that they're losing control, what I've noticed is, of course, in narcissism, we know that it just gets amped up, that they will do whatever they can to regain it. But what I also see is that they start creating flying monkeys of all these other people. Like all of a sudden everybody is sick and you're so mean and you're not calling. It's like it just gets larger and larger and larger. Do you see that happen in the UK as well?
100%. Yeah, you see that happening in the South Asian countries as well, because it is seen as a community. Like, it is not just everybody is raised seeing their cousins as their siblings.
Okay.
So, like, you won't just get told off by your parents. You are then told off by your uncles and your aunts. And even in traditionally in India, it's the whole village. If you've been naughty at school and words got round, then you've been told off by everyone. And you've been shamed into feeling like you've done something really, really bad. So the mother-in-law relationship is, I see this a lot as well. It's one of two ways. It's either the father-in-law or the mother-in-law. And generally, I do think that if the mother-in-law has experienced narcissism herself, she is very much understanding of her daughter-in-law. Mm-hmm. Whereas it's the ones that are the narcissists that feel that they have power and control over their daughter-in-law, that the daughter-in-law, her duty is to look after her. So it's that grandiosity, isn't it? I'm very important and I'm the queen of this house. You've essentially got to be my servant. You've got to do everything for me and look after me because it's your duty. Like, she was raised doing that for her in-laws, and now it's her daughter-in-law's role to pass that along. But what they don't understand is that a lot of the older generation, the women weren't educated, so they weren't then expected to hold down a job as well. Whereas now they are, and they're expected to do it all. So for the victim, she's just going to lose herself. She's giving out more than she's got. And she's constantly in survival mode, just trying to please everyone else in that fawn mode. She's just trying to keep her mother-in-law happy. And it's like, the only way she can do that is to sacrifice her own needs. It's that codependency, isn't it? That I have to please everyone else so I feel good enough. And that lack of self-love, self-care, self-respect, self-value, self-esteem. She hasn't been taught that. Being brought up as a girl, she wasn't taught to value herself or to respect herself. It was always, you've got to respect everyone else. You've got to value others' opinions over your own. You've got to care for others at the sacrifice of your self-care.
And I think that's a huge thing that I see with my clients is that when they come to me, it's the first time that they're thinking for themselves. And I know you said that too in your introduction, is that this becomes a space that they can actually think what they want, what they are thinking, and what they really feel. And to hear some new ideas on how some things can be, or what's appropriate from a boundary standpoint, and what's accepted behavior and not.
They've never seen boundaries set before. So it's like the girl has seen her mother pleasing the in-laws. So she hasn't seen her mother set boundaries. So then for her, it's difficult for her to set boundaries because you're made to feel like I failed, that if I can't do what my mum did, then I failed. And it must be me. And I've got to try harder and harder and harder. And then when they come into this situation where you show them a different possibility, but actually you can set a boundary and say that I need some time for me. You can do it respectfully. It doesn't mean that you have to do it in a horrible way. You can do it respectfully. And what I find is when my clients start to do that for themselves, it has a knock-on effect. And actually, they find that the people around them start to value themselves a bit more as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that boundaries in this dynamic have been very hard for my clients to set. And you and I touched on this when we were chatting before too. Can you talk to me about how you help clients regulate so that they can begin to even recognize their self-worth?
Yeah. So firstly, obviously, we do our nervous system education so they can then learn about their triggers. When they are going into fight-flight mode, the sympathetic nervous system, or when they're going into fawn freeze, their dorsal vagal, So first of all, I teach them to recognize the parts of them that they are blending with, similar to what you do. So we teach them when they are coming from themselves or when they are coming from a trauma. So then they can start to see that actually, I'm not an angry person. A part of me is angry. And then it begins to lift that shame and that self-blame and then the guilt that they feel. So when they don't feel that way, they start to understand that I'm important. We work on that reparenting and healing codependency so they are able to set boundaries. And it will be respectful boundaries. It will be small boundaries, like anything that's going to give them that little glimmer to put them into their ventral vagal nervous system of feeling safe and present. So even if it's like, okay, I'm going to go for a walk and just have some time to regulate myself, to be out of the danger zone, for example, out of the lion's den, and to feel safe. So then when they go back, they are able to then put up with that, the negativity around them without letting it affect them as much. But as we know, it has to be more feeling safe than feeling in danger. So it has to start very, very small, and they have to get comfortable with feeling that uncomfortable feeling of setting a boundary. I mean, I've had to go through this myself. There's a point where you just cannot please everyone, and you cannot be in two different locations at two different weddings that are 5 hours apart. And you do have to make a choice. And before, I would feel bad that I can't make both and I'm letting somebody down. But then there was a choice that I had to make where I've just got to say that, look, I'm not going to be able to make both, but I have to put a boundary in place. Otherwise, I'm going to burn out. So it feels uncomfortable when you first start doing that. But then it's starting to see the benefits of it. I set a boundary and actually I was able to be present and enjoy the one wedding that I did attend, which was a lot closer to me. And I was able to be more present and enjoy it. And it gave me, I was in my ventral vagal nervous system and I felt safe, and it gave me those glimmers of hope. So it's hard work when it's new. But as they get used to it and they start feeling the benefits, they start to be able to recognize that it's okay for me to set boundaries. It doesn't make me a bad person if I want to take some time out for self-care or I want to prioritize my mental health.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm not sure if you've had, I mean, actually, I'm pretty confident you've had this experience of once a client starts to create those boundaries and they're able to start to think for themselves, sometimes this whole reel of narcissism that they've gone through their whole life starts to play and things get so much clearer of what they've gone through.
Yeah.
I have certainly had some clients have a really hard time coming to grips with that and to also understand that they really can't approach it with their family. Like the healing is going to have to come from them, not necessarily in conversation with their family.
Yeah. I think with everyone, when you start learning about narcissism, you start to see the traits around you.
Mm-hmm.
And you start to see that actually you've been surrounded by this. You've been a magnet to narcissists pretty much your whole life. And when you start to see these things, you just want everyone else to see it. And you want everyone else to know that there is a way to get out of this. There is a way. You don't have to be under that control. There is a way to break free. And there is a way to take your power back. So a lot of the times, you know, especially me, like I feel the same way, that I want to just be able to tell everyone that it's okay for you to set a boundary. It's okay for you not to go to that. But there's so much inner work that has to be done. And people aren't always ready to accept that. Mm-hmm. So the way I help them to lift their shame and guilt is to understand generational trauma, transgenerational trauma, and that older generation have been brought up in a very different way to the way that we were brought up. And then their parents were brought up in a different way. And this trauma passes down 7 generations. So I could be holding 7 generations worth of trauma within me. And that is what is causing me to make the decisions that I make and to live my life the way that I live it. And if I don't heal that, then I'm going to pass it to the next generation. So it's something that I've chosen to be a cycle breaker. And there are going to be cycle breakers out there that are going to change things for the next generation. And it's giving them that safe space to know that what they're doing is going to have a ripple effect, but you can't kind of force it on anyone. They have to be ready to see that they can change as well. And sometimes when you lead that example, they start to think, oh my God, I want to be as free as her. I want to be as free as him. You know, I want to set those boundaries in place. Oh, she's stopped calling her mother-in-law in Pakistan every day. I want to be able to do that. So it's a ripple effect.
Yeah. Yeah. And so in narcissism, we talk so often about no contact. And when you said, you know, I want to be able to not call my mother-in-law every day, that is definitely a cycle that's so hard for my clients to break, of this feeling of I need to call and update them on my day. And then, they're constantly in that space of abuse. It happens every single day.
Yeah.
And if that feels like something they can't set a boundary on, what would you suggest to somebody that they could do if saying no, I can't call you every day is, the worst of the worst? Is there another boundary that you would recommend?
So the way that I would say they can handle that situation is to work on themselves, firstly, to be able to recognize their triggers so they can set their environment up for this phone call. For example, they can come from a place of safety. Maybe they've done some deep breathing exercises before, regulated themselves because they know that this call is coming. It's like they've got that warning that it could happen anytime, because you end up being controlled by when that phone's going to ring. And then secondly, the boundaries have to be respectful boundaries. You can't just say to them, I'm not going to call you anymore, because what that will do, it gives them more ammunition and it just gets them trapped into that power control cycle again. So it has to be done respectfully. And that is things like, for example, we're not going to be able to call you today because we're going out here, or we're doing this, or tomorrow. If they were on vacation, for example, they have every right to be able to just not call. And if they didn't have internet, so it's getting them used to these boundaries slowly. So maybe if it's a half an hour phone call, they reduce it to 15 minutes a day. And then at 15 minutes, they reduce it to 10 minutes. And then they might say, well, we're working late tomorrow. We're not going to be able to pick up, or we're out the next day. Is doing it slowly. So it also gives them at the other end some time to digest that this is fizzling out. Unfortunately, you can't just set a boundary and say that we're going no contact. They will then get their flying monkeys involved. You start getting calls from the extended family, and then they will up the abuse essentially and the control.
Yeah, I've even seen that the family, like the in-laws will show up at the wife's family's home.
Yep.
And, and I think that, I don't know, I guess I'm from New York, New York City. So like in my culture, like that it would never happen, I'm sure, yes, it does happen, of course. But like, like my mom would never go over to like my ex-husband's home, and start yelling at his mom, that's just not something that's going to happen over something like this.
What it is the in-laws are essentially saying that your daughter's the problem, that our son is perfect. It's your daughter that's the problem. And it's your duty as a parent to tell your daughter what's right and what's wrong. And if they believe that it's right that they call them every day, then it's up to the parents to then say that you've got to respect your in-laws. You need to call them every day. That's why they get them involved. The parents essentially become the flying monkeys. And because they are so controlled by them not wanting their daughter to suffer, they will then tell her to basically fawn.
Yeah. Well, every time that, in this conversation, that I've realized that we're back in like that shame spiral. I've written down shame, and I just looked down at my notebook and I can see it like 7 times, that there's this constant shaming to get something done, or constant shaming so that somebody else doesn't have to regulate. Like, it's almost like the woman is shamed so that the mother-in-law doesn't have to have any feelings of discomfort. It's almost like she's so codependent on her son getting that supply that she will shame everyone until she gets it.
That's it. That is exactly it, because she's not self-aware enough. And also she's not allowed to be in tune with herself and her emotions. She's had to numb out her feelings from a very, very young age. She's been in that functional freeze because her opinions didn't matter. Whatever she wanted to do, the life that she wanted to live, like, it wasn't able to happen. For the mother-in-law as well, like, I don't want to make it out that, because it is generational trauma at the end of the day, right? A narcissist is only the way they are. It doesn't excuse the abuse, but they are only a narcissist because of their own wounds. Mm-hmm. And the mother-in-law, she's got her own wounds, and she's not able to see that and feel those wounds. It's just too painful. So for her, she does have to blame everyone else and control them. But for our generation, we are much more in tune with our feelings because we are allowed to be. Whereas in their generation, like, they weren't allowed to cry. So they just learned that I have to numb my feelings out. So partly she's not able to even see what she's feeling. it is like, this is my duty and I'm not allowed to feel, because if I feel, I get into trouble. So from a young age, when you're 3 years old, if you've been told off for something, you can't fight your parents and you can't run away from them. So you have to go into that freeze mode. Your nervous system has to put you in a mode where you can survive this punishment and the way that you've been made to feel for doing something wrong. As a child, you're just learning. But because your emotional needs aren't met, you are then having to just numb yourself out as much as you can. So from the mother-in-law's point of view, she's not going to change and she's not going to be able to see that. And the daughter-in-law could spend her whole life being controlled by her or trying to make her husband see what the mother's doing. And she would just lose herself even more. So I always say to redirect that energy and attention they're giving to everyone else back to them, to focus on their healing. So they are able to then think more rationally about what's going on around them. They are able to work on their inner child wounds that are causing that shame to come up.
In my work, I personally sometimes feel challenged when I'm helping my client regulate themselves and come back to themselves and have a sense of self within the relationship. And then the relationship starts to feel like intolerable for them. You know, that they're repulsed by this person, but they don't feel like they can leave because of the stigma of divorce in India or in South Asian culture. If somebody felt like they couldn't get divorced, or actually, I want to rephrase that because I want my clients to believe that they could get divorced. I'm divorced. I know you mentioned you are. Like, if somebody is feeling like they can't get out of the relationship, how would you support them if they wanted to begin to think about actually leaving?
Yes. So the first thing would be to help them recognize all of the wounds that they've got, to help them understand codependency and where it stems from, to help them reparent themselves so they can. You can't go through a divorce unless you're able to manage yourself, right? If you've been controlled your whole life, if you've been controlled financially, if you've been controlled in where you go, who you speak to, what you do, and you don't have that support around you, you have to get yourself to a point where you can look after yourself. So becoming independent is one of the first things that I teach them, that you can leave. It's safe for you to leave, but you have to get to that stage where you're able to accept that this is the only way out. You've got to make that decision whether you're going to live your life and lose yourself completely, end up with all these illnesses, or you're going to deal with the stigma and live your life. Like, for example, when I was going through my most difficult time leaving, when I was upset, it did upset the people around me, like my parents, for example. But when I got to that point of accepting it and saying, you know what, I can do this, when I felt safe and I was in my ventral vagal and I was able to say, you know what, I will deal with this. I feel safe with any challenge that's going to come my way. They were able to see that it was for the better, that me leaving was actually going to be better for me, my future and my children than me staying in a toxic situation. So I recommend them to work on themselves, to build themselves up. And when you're in a state where you can think rationally, you can see it for what it is. Whereas a lot of the times they don't see it as abuse because it's so normalized. It's like my mum spoke to my dad like that, or, you know, my father-in-law speaks to my mother-in-law like that. My husband speaks to me like that. It's just normal. They don't even recognize that it's abuse because their version of love is abuse. And it's just all they've known their whole lives, especially being a girl. Like, she's always been put in her place. If the male in the household, if her brothers were able to go out at 14, she wasn't allowed to. It was very different. She was expected to cook and clean when people came over, whereas the males in the household were able to go do what they want. So she was always doing things for others. So it's redirecting that attention back to herself and making herself strong enough to be able to see that she can respect herself and value herself enough to leave. She's not giving up and she's not failing. She is respecting herself and valuing herself enough to know that she deserves more.
Yeah. And coming out of that, like being able to get to that space after being in such a strong place of shame takes a tremendous amount of work and courage. And, you know, I think that it's almost like when you're able to show them that, or show clients there's like another way to see things. There's another, you know, there's other possibilities to help them get to that place of their brain where they can think clearly. It's almost as if you're just like putting lights on in places that they've never been before.
100%. Yeah, that is exactly it, because they've been in that fight, flight, fawn, freeze. You know, their nervous system responses have been in stress. so much that they don't know that they can feel safe. They don't know that there is another option out there. They just think that this is my life and it's always been like that and it's got to be that way. There is no other option. So when you do show them and you put the light on, they are able to see other possibilities. And I see that so much with my clients. They're like, oh, I didn't even know that that is a possibility, that I can survive, that I can leave. Because all they've known is that you've just got to stay in this and deal with it. A lot of people are told to become stronger instead of, if you reach out for help, you're told that, you've got to become stronger. You've just got to deal with it. It's your problem, basically. So then they are going to feel like it is them and that they have to just deal with it and they're the problem. So it keeps them trapped in that cycle like, oh, it is just me. I have to make myself better to understand that, he just wants to work 24 hours a day, that he doesn't want to give me attention, that it is my job to just cook and clean and please his family. So they've got to be able to see the other side of that they are allowed to do what they want to as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What do you think the long-lasting effects are of almost like an entire culture living a lot of their life stuck in that dorsal vagal?
I think the past generations have lived like that. And that is what is perpetuating this narcissism just being passed on and passed on and passed on. And I think now it's changing.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that the generation now, we've kind of got through that phase, right, of it just, there are cycle breakers now, basically.
Yeah.
But because everyone has lived in dorsal vagal for so long and it's just become so normalized, it's taken it to get to that really kind of the worst state that it can be for people to now see there's a way out. So the more we talk about it, the more we raise awareness and the more people know that what narcissism is, what emotional abuse is, what psychological abuse is, that, you don't just have to be physically abused to be being abused. Like, people don't know that it's abuse if you are being verbally abused, emotionally abused. So it's raising that awareness so they can see that there is a way out and that the life they're living being trapped is not normal. I don't know if that answered the question.
Yeah, no, that absolutely did. That has been the thread of, our whole conversation, is that there's normalized abuse on a cultural level, on a society level. And I didn't even bring up the fact that a lot of the abuse we're talking about is purely mental and verbal and emotional. And of course, there's physical too, but that's not what I'm seeing in my work the majority of the time. I'm seeing a lot of tons of emotional abuse, and that we know in our societies how that's downplayed in terms of, you're too sensitive, you're this, you're that. But in a society of shame, when even saying something like, I feel like I'm being abused, you're just going to be told that you're not immediately faster.
Yeah.
It can have such an effect on your self-worth, your self-esteem, and even your ability to think it can be anything different.
Yeah. So you've got to remember that, like, traditionally, where everybody's raised in these little villages and it's a whole community, it's much harder to hide the scars and the bruises and the aches and the pains. So it is much easier to abuse emotionally and psychologically without other people knowing that is what's going on behind closed doors.
Yeah.
Potentially anyone could walk in your house at any point, and if you've got a black eye, you've got to answer those questions. So generally it will be more psychological abuse because it is easier to hide and it's easier to do it behind closed doors.
Yeah. Misha, I have loved talking to you, and I think this was so informative. And I know a lot of people that listen to this, they're really going to have their eyes opened to what's happening. And I really do think a lot of people are going to feel normal, like that their experience is normalized, and maybe they'll have the courage to seek some help.
I hope so. Thank you so much for having me. And just one thing I wanted to say is that South Asian cultures are so beautiful and they're so enriching. And I know you've experienced a lot as well, being, in the yoga industry. Like,
yeah,
it is so beautiful. And it is just something that has gone wrong on the way with trauma, unhealed trauma. So the whole trauma healing space is just so important for us to give that acceptance that it's okay to not be okay, and it's okay to reach out for help, and it's okay to not want to follow this cultural conditioning that you believe is wrong. It's okay to believe that it's wrong when previously that's all people have known, and it's okay to want a change.
Yeah, thank you so much for saying that. I think that's such an important point. And I certainly don't want this podcast to come off as, narcissism is born in India, or anything like that. That's absolutely not I am confident that I could do narcissism in any other, insert country, even just America, and be able to have an equally informative discussion on how it's like bred and born. I just think that because of the amount of shame that we've seen that gets normalized, it's really hard for a lot of people to like see that there's another way. But it's I've been to South Asia more than once, and it's like breathtakingly beautiful. The other day I found pictures of when I was sitting by the Ganges and watching I believe it was an evening prayer over the river, and I daydream about it at times, and it doesn't take away from like the beauty of the country, and also that this is just one part of it.
Yeah, that's exactly it. That is it. As toxic as areas can be, there's also so much healing. There's so many things in the culture that are healing, that people are turning to. And I just hope that it changes for the future generation, and that we can be the cycle breakers and we can heal so the next generation can heal and be brought up in a very different way, where the emotions are heard, where they are allowed to feel safe, to be able to talk about whatever they want to. And like I said, I am seeing it change in my world. So I'm hoping that it will change as a collective.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also hope that people will be able to get the help that they need if they need it. I know how hard it is for a client in my culture to say, I need help. I can't imagine what it's like to say it in some other cultures around the world, and to be able to normalize mental health struggles and get help just as you would if you broke your arm.
That's it. That is exactly it. Yeah.
Misha, how can people find you if they want to connect with you?
So I'm available on social media, and my handle is @therapywithmisha, MISHA, because a lot of people put a C in it. And my website is www.therapywithmisha.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure.